Good evening, and thank you for joining us for this, the first of a 7-part series titled Wasted, Small Efforts for a Big Change. The program is planned around a series of conversations about waste, environmental justice, and the role we play in the future of sustainability. I'm Tony Marino, Executive Director of the Rockwall Foundation. Founded in 1935, our mission is to promote and support environmental education and conservation in the lower Connecticut River Valley. Please go to rockwall.org, rockwallfoundation.org, to find out more. Rockwall has been pleased to collaborate with the following co-sponsors: the City of Middletown, Lower Connecticut River Valley Council of Governments, better known as RiverCog, and Wesleyan University Sustainability Office. This program could not have happened without the assistance of many individuals, in particular Cheryl Baldwin, Janice Ehlemeyer, Jen Kleindienst, Kim O'Rourke, and members of the Rockwall Program Committee. A special shout out to Liz Brittany, the Communications and Grants Coordinator at Rockwall, as she will be managing the mechanics of today's meeting. And to Michelle Ekman, Program Consultant to Rockwall. When you work with Michelle, you go big and you do it well. So thank you to all of them. We also would like to acknowledge the heritage of the indigenous people of the state of Connecticut. We understand that the issues we discuss throughout this series acknowledge the responsibilities that we hold for social and environmental justice and the protection of natural resources entrusted to us by those on whose land we live, work, and play. The theme of tonight's discussion is environmental justice of waste. And I'd like to start by introducing Cheryl Baldwin. Cheryl has worked in sustainability materials management for over 30 years and at DEEP since 2008. Current projects include the Increased Recycling Working Group for the Connecticut Coalition for Sustainable Materials Management, Recycle CT Foundation, What's In, What's Out initiative, and the Connecticut WRAP program. She facilitates the creation of a universal list of acceptable recyclables for Connecticut in partnership with materials recovery facilities. She provides professional development for municipal recycling coordinators. It is on the Connecticut Greenleaf Schools Advisory Council. She is also a founder of EcoWorks, a creative reuse center for the arts in North Haven. And so Cheryl, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Tony. Liz, if you'll go ahead and put up my slide deck, that would be great. And thank you very much for having me this evening. I'm very excited to be part of this series. And if you'll go to the next slide. So what I'm about to do is to, back one, please. Thank you. So what I'm about to do is give a very brief history of waste in Connecticut. Okay, go ahead for the next slide, Liz, thanks. So I'm starting with a quote from Aldo Leopold, because when we think about waste, we often think about how when we dispose of our materials, it's land applied. It's put in the land, it's put under the land, and it somehow impacted the land. Aldo Leopold is well known for talking about that we don't recognize the value of land in general. But something else about the land, when we think about sustainable materials management, we also have to think about where those resources were originally extracted from. And in most cases, they are extracted from land. I also wanted to start with a quote from Aldo Leopold, because while historically the white community looks at Aldo Leopold as a conservationist, and we embrace that, he is traditionally coming from the white environmental movement. And while he may not have acknowledged what some refer to as the historic trauma of Native Americans or First Peoples, he did understand the impact of land exploitation falling disproportionately on the poor and on Black and Indigenous people. So it's sort of a mixed bag. However, what we can recognize is that he did embrace the land ethic, and he did try to help educate people about the value of land. Next slide, please. So with that, we have to sort of think about where did we come from, where are we now, and where are we going? And I also like to think about definitions and what are the terms and what do they mean? And when I think about trash, I think of it as this definition here, but now we use these words interchangeably. Trash is garbage and garbage is refuse and refuse is rubbish. But if we think about it historically, these terms had very, very different meanings. They were had very specific meanings that were tied to how that material would be managed. And so it's a good reminder to think about the words that we use don't always have the same meanings to all of us. Kind of like Aldo Leopold had his lens, we also have a lens in the terms that we use that are going to impact how we look at the past, the present, and the future. Next slide. So I didn't realize Tony was sort of couching or framing this series in terms of the people that were here before us. But if we look at the place that before it was called Connecticut, it of course had a number of indigenous people here. And often what happens is there is of course the study of archaeology, where we use that study to help us understand cultures and communities that were there before us. And so if we use archaeology, we actually tend to look at what people discarded. And what they discarded helps us understand what that culture is about. And so the Mashantucket Pequot tribe did a research study at Hidden Creek, and there they found broken and discarded tools and debitage. I love that word, which is basically small flakes of stone used to make tools. So what did they leave behind? To the untrained eye, it might just be stone, a bunch of rock. But what it tells archaeologists is sort of what their community is and how it was made up. But for us, we have to think about, well, what didn't they leave? There's no metal, there's no ceramics, there's no glass, and there's no plastic. Next slide, please. So if we move into the colonial period is very different. I can tell you, I live in New Haven, and I have groundhogs, and the groundhogs have unearthed an old outhouse. Is that exciting or what? And do you know what they found? Exactly what archaeologists find in colonial trash: ceramics, glass, shells, bones, and building debris. It tells us something about the community that came before based on what it is that they throw away. And in New Amsterdam, which is of course now known as New York City, as early as 1657, they had to pass a law to prohibit people from throwing trash into the streets. And like most cities in New England, if burying trash was not an option, which wasn't for most urban environments, they ended up throwing it into the waterways, the river, and the ocean. And it was in 1872 that New York City finally stopped throwing refuse into the East River and continued to put it into the oceans. And by 1882, New York City had constructed its first garbage incinerator. It gives us a sense of where we've come from. We still aren't in the current place, but we're getting pretty close. Next slide, please. So where is away? This is a question that we ask a lot in terms of children and teachers as well as ourselves. Where does our material go? We could look at open dumps. Originally, they were waste lands. It's land that was just wasted. We call them wetlands now. They became landfills where we covered the waste every day to try to prevent vermin getting around. Then we discovered that they leach into the water. So then we created sanitary landfills with a liner on the bottom and covering it every day. In parallel, we had open burning. Sometimes that open burning happened in open dumps and just spontaneous combustion. Sometimes people just openly burned. Then it moved into mass burn, kind of like the New York City incinerator, just one big furnace throwing in our trash. And then that moved on to waste to energy, where they started to capture that energy so that that energy wouldn't be lost through the combustion of trash. And now where are we? We look at recycling, composting, and anaerobic digestion as solutions, which is fantastic. But at the same time, they still are in a way. Next slide. Waste reduction and reuse are often overlooked because they're harder. They include behavior change and also the concepts of redesign. I know you're probably laughing because you're like, why is she showing us a pizza? But I'll tell you, here's 3 examples that I want to help you sort of think about the big picture. We don't want to go to the store to buy batteries and then to dispose of them. What we're looking for is a mobile energy source. When we go to the grocery store, we're not looking to get dozens of bags that we can then bring home and figure out what to do with. We just need to figure out how to transport our groceries from the store to our home. And I don't need a little plastic table in the middle of my pizza. I'm just trying to figure out how can I ensure that I won't lose all my cheese on the top of the pizza box? And in this case, that is a knot of dough. So we need to rethink how we purchase and think about the amount, how can we reduce the generation of waste to begin with? Next slide. So this is my last slide. And I just want to bring up the issue of timelines. Timelines are fascinating to help us understand the past, the present, and sort of think about where we're going. A trash timeline helps us think about when materials were created, what materials were created, and why did we create them. It helps us think about production and manufacturing, and also what potential trash may be produced. So if we look at 1776, the first metal recycling in America occurs when patriots in New York City melt down a statue of King George III and make it into bullets. That tells us so much. It tells us they had the capability of making bullets, of melting metal, but it also helped us understand their priorities. Their priorities were not statues anymore, but rather it was to create bullets for a revolution. And then if you go down to the next line, 1792, it says Benjamin Franklin used to carry Philadelphia's waste downstream. That also gives us, sadly, a piece of history that we may be ashamed of, and it may embarrass us, and it may make us feel uncomfortable, but it is in fact our history. It's our history that enslaved people, specifically Black or African Americans, helped produce and create this country, and that is often overlooked and not acknowledged. And the reason I also wanted to bring this up is I know working for the agency, we talk a lot about green jobs. There's jobs in energy, but there's also jobs in the materials economy and in recycling. And we think about green jobs now. Most of those green jobs of especially brown and Black faces tend to be collecting trash at the curb, or it's processing and sorting in a sort line. You don't see a lot of folks that are in the executive level. And I just wanted to call out that as we think about green jobs, we also have to think about how can we get more diversity in the executive level to create this change and develop the solutions with us, as opposed to being in certain areas of the industry. And with that, I say thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to listening to the next speakers. Thank you. Tony, you're on mute.
No, I'm not. Thank you, Cheryl, and I apologize for that mute error. I'd also like to remind you that you can add your questions to chat at any time, and we'll get to those questions after our speakers. I would like to welcome Sharon Lewis as our next presenter this evening. Sharon is the Executive Director of the Connecticut Coalition for Environmental Justice. CCEJ has worked tirelessly for more than 2 decades to eliminate or mitigate the environmental injustices borne by low-income and communities of color, and to provide a seat at the table where the rules, laws, and policies regarding the environment are formulated and implemented. I want to welcome Sharon and I think her guest Monica to address us now. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to talk to groups about my favorite subject, environmental justice. I'm going to make a brief presentation today, followed by a presentation from Monica Jackson, who is a member of, the Connecticut Coalition for Environmental Justice. And she'll be talking about the health effects suffered by members of her family. For those of you who've listened to me before, know that my presentations are usually very detailed and very long. This is an abbreviated version of my presentation, which is called Waste and Race. Next slide, please. In 1987, there was a landmark study commissioned by the United Church of Christ to study the location of hazardous waste sites in the United States. I'm so sorry about that phone. As a result of protests in 1982 that were in Warren County, North Carolina, due to illegal dumping of toxic waste from a transformer company in a predominantly Black neighborhood. This event in 1982 was not the first injustice, but it was the first to start or spark a national movement as a result of the study that was commissioned by the United Church of Christ. Next slide, please. This report basically determined that 3 out of 4 hazardous waste sites in the South were located in communities of color. It also determined that there is a disproportionate environmental burden that is borne by low-income and communities of color. Now, I need to make sure that you understand what I mean by this, because often when people refer to environmental justice, they say low-income communities, but it's low-income whites, communities of color, and Black people of all incomes. So race, not income, is the determining factor of when and where something is cited. And that is a part of environmental racism. Next slide, please. So, oh, I'm sorry, I don't really want to go there, but we can just leave this up. You need to understand that this 1987 project that was commissioned determined that the majority of these hazardous waste facilities are located in people of color neighborhoods. And it also determined, as I said, that when deciding where to locate commercial, industrial, and military hazardous waste sites, the poorer and the darker the community, the greater the risk of environmental abuse, because the economically privileged are able to move away or to keep it from their neighborhoods. And that's a privilege that is not available to environmental justice communities, which are poor and white and Black and all other poor people of color. For example, in 2017, it was determined that of the 149 metropolitan cities with hazardous waste sites, 105 of the 149 are located in EJ communities. And of the 50 states in the United States, only 44 states had regional waste facilities, but 40 of the 44 had regional waste facilities with a very high and disproportionate percentage of people of color living very close by and hosting, being the host communities of these facilities. People of color are exposed to greater rates of pollution than society at large and experience higher rates of chronic diseases, such as asthma, heart disease, other respiratory issues, obesity, type 2 diabetes, and disproportionate share of COVID-19. Due to the impacts of a changing climate and the greenhouse gases, which produce heavy rains, floods, fires, heat waves, cold spells, all to the burning of waste, and among other things, tailpipe pollution. Now, this slide says, where are EJ communities located? Contrary to popular belief, not all EJ communities are located in urban areas. For example, the EJ community that sparked the national movement was in a rural area in the South. In fact, most of the areas in the South are rural that have the most environmental injustices. Next slide, please. So you need to understand who lives in an environmental justice community. Low-income whites, Latinx, Blacks of any income, and other people of color, because as I said, race, not class, is the determining factor where environmental injustices occur. So it would be incorrect for you to say that environmental justice involves low income and communities of color. I'm sorry, it would be correct to say low income communities of color. You need to say low income and communities of color. Next slide, please. So why are so many hazardous facilities located in communities of color? Well, for a couple of reasons. One being that they're powerless, they are disenfranchised, they're unfamiliar with the permitting process, they don't really have the ability to attend the hearings for the permitting processes, which are usually in the middle of the day. Only white collar workers can leave their job for a few hours and still get paid for it. They're unfamiliar with the euphemisms. I mean, there's 100 different ways to say incinerator, and one of the most popular and innocuous ways is to say it's a waste to energy plant. A lot of people will support that. We're going to turn my garbage into something good, energy. And there's also the lure of jobs and economic development. Now, you're talking about people who don't have access to jobs, meaningful jobs. So these facilities come into the neighborhood and promise people jobs. They promise that they're going to develop the area where they live and improve their property values. But sadly, none of these promises ever come true. And as Cheryl mentioned earlier, the people who feel that they're going to get a livable wage job end up getting the worst and the dirtiest and the most dangerous jobs available. They're the ones who are picking up the garbage on the curb. They're the ones who are on the tipping floor, sorting through the garbage. They're the ones who are actually involved in igniting the trash and making sure that it gets incinerated and pulling out all the stuff that shouldn't be burned, like metals. But then most importantly, and this is something, the next item that a lot of people don't understand, when they don't see meaningful presence at hearings and at different venues where people need to be to oppose certain undesirable facilities. You need to understand the makeup of the majority of the environmental justice communities are composed of renters, not homeowners. So there's a different motivation. Renters really don't care. It's not that they don't care about their health, but they have the ability to move. They're mobile. They have the ability to say, look, you know, I don't want to live near this incinerator. I'm so glad the CCEJ told me about it. We're moving across town. But if you're a property owner, you don't have that ability to do that. And a lot of people don't understand why oftentimes the room is not filled up with people. Now, that's not the only reason, but that's a major reason that nobody considers. There are different motivations when it comes to people protesting. The next slide, please. Connecticut has 5 incinerators, one in Preston, one in Lisbon, one in Putnam, which is an ash landfill for incinerators, one in Hartford, and one in Bridgeport. But you need to understand that Hartford and Bridgeport are the 2 largest, and they're located in environmental justice communities. Each of these is larger than the other 3 combined. So Hartford is larger than Preston, Lisbon, and Putnam combined. Bridgeport is larger than Preston, Lisbon, and Putnam combined. And sadly, depending on who you're talking to, Hartford will say it's the largest, and then Bridgeport will say we're the largest in Connecticut. And Cheryl, I'm so glad you introduced the issue of the first incinerator in the United States, because you are correct. In 1882, New York City was the location of the first trash incinerator in America. My hero, Nikola Tesla, fought with the officials to keep it out of the city, citing health concerns. He knew back then that an incinerator too close to populations would cause adverse health effects. But sadly, he was overruled. He was correct in many, many ways, in addition to this incinerator situation. But I wonder what it would have been like if they had listened to Nikola Tesla. Next slide, please. This is a picture of the Wheelabrator plant in Bridgeport. Next slide, please. And this is a picture of Hartford's incinerator plant. Both of these incinerators are located in the inner city. Both of these incinerators are regional incinerators, which means that, for example, Hartford accepts trash from greater than 51 towns who, once their trash leaves the curb, it goes to a transfer station in their town, and the trash is trucked to Hartford. 51 towns send their trash to Hartford. Bridgeport, on the other hand, I believe it's less than 100 towns, but Bridgeport also accepts trash from different states, like I believe some parts of Massachusetts and New York. And one of the differences between Hartford and Bridgeport is that Bridgeport also burns contraband from the police department, which, as they described it to us, illegal drugs. It could be meth, it could be marijuana, it could be whatever. Sadly, another difference between Hartford and Bridgeport is that the Bridgeport facility is within 1,000 feet from the front door of the folks who live at PT Barnum Housing Complex. So just imagine the folks there who inhale the pollution from the stacks of Wheelabrator in Bridgeport. And when we found out that they also burn contraband from illegal drugs, just imagine what that might do to the health of some folks. And by the way, both of these facilities burn 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The people who live near these incinerators are assaulted by life-altering, health-affecting pollution. Next slide, please. So, in addition to tipping fees, you need to understand that host communities pay an additional cost. The Hartford facility and the Bridgeport facility have numerous fires and explosions, technical malfunctions. The Hartford facility had 2 technical malfunctions. I believe it was 2019, where the turbines broke down. The towns continued to send their trash to Hartford, and it was piled up in and around the facility for weeks. This happened twice. Can you imagine the vermin and the unsightliness and the smells that the neighborhood had to endure because of this technical breakdown? Then there's also the cost to the city of police and fire personnel. You know, when there's a fire or an explosion, the police and the fire department comes. And then there's the road infrastructure. I mean, all those diesel trucks coming in and out all the time. The roads are horrible. There's all kinds of potholes there, cracks in the asphalt. It's horrible. And then public works, because oftentimes there seems to be on some days more trash falling off the trucks getting to the incinerator than being tipped on the ground, on the tipping floor. So there are all kinds of issues that people don't understand and additional costs that are borne by the host community. Next slide, please. Another cost of being borne by the host community are some of the major adverse health effects associated with living with incinerator pollution. It affects your brain, kidney, liver, blood, and reproductive system. But the number one adverse health effect has to do with respiratory diseases. That is why COVID-19 has found a home within the EJ communities, because so many people have respiratory issues. Next slide, please. So I can't breathe. This was something that folks all throughout the United States were saying long before George Floyd and Eric Garner, two folks who were murdered by police in New York and also Minnesota. EJ communities are disproportionately affected with higher than average hospitalizations, emergency room visits, and deaths due to asthma and other respiratory issues, including heart attacks. Hartford, Bridgeport, and New Haven rates are among the highest in the nation. For example, depending on which list you look at and which year, the American Lung Association puts out a list of the top 10 worst cities to live in with regard to poor air. And at any given time, Hartford, Bridgeport, and New Haven are always, playing musical chairs with regard to who's going to be on that list this year. I remember one year, all three were in the top 10 urban areas that were contributing to adverse health conditions. And if you notice the bottom, I said malaria, because the word malaria means bad air. And that's what happens when you can't breathe. You're breathing bad air. Next slide, please. So what are some of the harmful pollution from the stacks? Dioxins, the most dangerous chemicals known to man. Particulate matter, fine particulate matter, 2.5 in fact, which is very, very fine. Some people call it soot. It gets into your lungs and destroys your respiratory system. Heavy metals, fly ash and bottom ash, which comes from the combustion of trash. In fact, the dioxins are produced from the incomplete combustion, because the combustion is never 100% and never fully done. Carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases, which contribute to global warming and climate change, which, as we all know, the EJ communities are the first and hardest hit by the vagaries of the climate, which they seldom can recover from. And then, of course, lead comes out of the stack, and cadmium, and so many other toxins that contribute to the poor health and livelihood of people who are living among this type of pollution. Next slide. So I would like to introduce Monica Jackson, who would like to tell you a little bit about her family's experience living at P.T. Barnum Housing Complex in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Monica?
Good evening. I've been living in Bridgeport, Connecticut my whole life. I had the opportunity to move out of Bridgeport a few times during my life, and it was a complete culture shock in doing that. 7 people in my family do suffer from respiratory illness. And I actually have an aunt who is working off of 1 lung right now, and she was also born and raised in P.T. Barnum. I didn't really know much about my community and where I lived until I became a part of CCEJ, and actually took the time to care and want to know about what was going on in my community. But I did find out that P.T. Barnum created the P.T. Barnum Apartments in the beginning for workers who were working long hours and needed a place to stay. In some way, shape, or form, it became a place for low-income families to live. And most low-income families weren't really knowledgeable about the surroundings of their environment. Wheelabrator Bridgeport is just one of 3 sites that cause major pollution in that corner of the West End community. And nothing is 100%, as Ms. Lewis said earlier. With that being said, during my 10 years plus living there as an adult, the smells that came from the plants, I don't think anyone should have had to endure. The dirt that was in the wind every time it blew and it laid on your windshield, and you breathe it in, your kids breathe it in as they're playing outside. The contaminated grounds that PT and also the school was built on, Longfellow Elementary School was built on. All of the hundreds of trucks that come through daily for the O&G asphalt site, for the waste treatment facility, and Wheelabrator Bridgeport. The trash that Sharon spoke about is real. I lived it every day. I smelt it every day, and it kind of became a normal for myself and the people in the community. Like when we go home, we're just expecting a stench. When we go home, we're expecting to hear loud trucks and the noise. The trucks that idle out there while our kids are waiting for school, it's a painful sight to see. But at the same time, before I joined CCEJ, it was the norm for me. I didn't know anything about it. This wasn't something that they gave to you when you first accepted your application for moving into PT Barnum. I just want the work that's being done today to actually protect our future generations. I know that these places are needed, so please don't get me wrong. I do understand that we need the waste to energy facilities, that we need the asphalt plants, that we need the water pollution sites. But our families, our low-income families, don't deserve or need to live in those type of environments. These things happen over years and years ago, and I believe that once we find out and we have this knowledge, it's our job to make a difference and to change. Those families are as important as any other families in any other community. It's up to us now, because we know to make a difference, to demand change for our future generations. We fight every day. My father fights every day. My sisters fight every day. My sister was 8 months pregnant when she had a severe asthma attack and ended up in the hospital. My aunt was on her way to a wedding and her lung collapsed, so she couldn't see her sister get married. My father, he's a pastor now. Every day he walks around with his asthma pump because he can't go far without it. My 2 youngest nieces, they suffer from the same thing. And this is all because of the environment that we lived in, and we had no choice because we weren't wealthy. We didn't have enough money, and we didn't have a choice to move somewhere different. A lot of people in the community that I lived in basically made me feel like I was a complainer because of the knowledge that I gained, that I wasn't okay, and that, you know, I wasn't appreciative of what I had, because PT Barnum is low income and you didn't have to pay much money to live there. And, you know, you have a stable place over your head. And there were a lot of other violations that came from living in PT Barnum that, you know, I would love to discuss, but I won't discuss it now. But once we know, it's our responsibility and it's our choice to make sure that we're doing something to change this. Being in that community for so long, it was the normal, just like I'm telling you now. And until we continue to educate people more and more families are going to continue to grow up in that type of environment and think it's okay. I thank you very much for allowing me to come here and share just a brief moment of my experience and my family's experience. And I do speak for many other people who aren't able to speak right now. I just hope that it's going to make a difference. And I thank you guys very much for taking the opportunity to listen to me and my story regarding my family. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you both to Sharon and for Monica for that wonderful presentation. We appreciate the information very much. Our next presenter is Kevin Budris. Kevin is a staff attorney in the Zero Waste Project at the Conservation Law Foundation. Kevin's work focuses on advancing zero waste solutions, such as responsible production, waste reduction, reuse, composting, and recycling, while opposing landfill expansions, waste incinerators, and other polluting practices that threaten our communities and our environment. Before joining CELF, Kevin worked at the National Environmental Law Center, where he litigated citizens enforcement lawsuits against companies in violation of federal environmental statutes. Kevin, welcome.
Thank you so much, Tony, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. It's really an honor to be here with you and share the virtual floor, so to speak, with Cheryl and Sharon and Monica and Alex, who will follow me. If you could please pull my slides up. Great, thank you. So I tonight am going to dive a little bit into the data and the patterns around waste and injustice in Connecticut. As Monica just said, you know, it's our responsibility to change the injustices that come with the way that Connecticut manages its waste. And the more we understand about what's in that waste, where it's coming from, and especially, as Monica and Sharon highlighted, where it's ending up, the more we're empowered to actually put into place some of the solutions that Alex is going to talk about later to make a real difference and change these patterns. Next slide, please. So as Tony mentioned, I work with Conservation Law Foundation, which is a member-supported nonprofit that works to protect New England's environment for all people. I'm a member of the Zero Waste Project at CLF, which focuses on moving us past dangerous and antiquated technologies and systems like landfilling and incineration, and towards a cleaner, more just zero waste future with an emphasis on the zero waste hierarchy, which prioritizes rethinking and redesigning our production and waste systems, emphasizing reuse, production, diversion, recycling, and composting and material recovery without burning any waste, and without waste practices that result in dangerous emissions to air, or land, or water, and that endanger the health of humans and the environment. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to cover in reviewing some of the information tonight is really the geography of injustices around waste in Connecticut, the impacts of burning waste, which you've already heard about, and how we can move past some of the false choices that are often presented to us and forward toward those real, actual, clean, just zero waste solutions. Next slide, please. So starting with the geography here in Connecticut, if you move to the next slide, please. Looking first at the numbers on waste in Connecticut. In 2018, and this is according to data from Connecticut Deep, in 2018, Connecticut generated a little bit less than 2.4 million tons of waste, which is very close to the amount of waste that Connecticut generated more than a decade ago, back in 2009. So despite many of the recycling and diversion efforts that have taken place so far, we're really not doing enough to dramatically reduce the amount of waste that Connecticut's generating and disposing. And of that waste, in 2018, almost 2 million tons were burned in incinerators in Connecticut, and a little bit more than 460,000 tons were shipped out of state. Overall, this comes out to more than 1,300 pounds of waste per person every year. And if we look just at residential waste, it's around 750 pounds per person per year. And while it's easier to, let's say, average out waste generation when you look across the state, you can't do that when it comes to the burdens of waste disposal. If you could move to the next slide, please. Because as Sharon highlighted earlier, the vast majority of Connecticut's waste ends up burned in Hartford and in Bridgeport, in low income and communities of color. In fact, around 2/3 of the waste that Connecticut's burning in incinerators is being burned in Hartford and Bridgeport. The tonnage data that I have up on this slide is from 2018. And in 2018, more than 750,000 tons of waste were burned in the Bridgeport incinerator and almost 475,000 tons in the Hartford incinerator. And that is actually a down year for the Hartford incinerator. As Sharon mentioned, the aging mirror incinerator is, I would say, consistently breaking down. So it's burning less waste in recent years than it otherwise would be. Next slide, please. And if we zoom in a little closer on the Hartford incinerator, in line with what Sharon was saying, we see in 2018 that about 84,000 tons of that waste came from Hartford, which means that almost 400,000 came from those other 51 communities that Sharon mentioned all across the state. So whiter, wealthier communities throughout the state are generating the vast, vast majority of this waste, and it's being shipped all across the state and being burned in Hartford. Next slide, please. And unfortunately, this fits a nationwide pattern. A majority of waste incinerators throughout the country are located in environmental justice communities, low income and communities of color. Next slide, please. And so, especially with that in mind, the impacts of burning waste and the burdens on those communities are stark. And Sharon and Monica spoke at length about this. Next slide, please. But I'll just highlight again that burning waste is toxic. The air emissions from incinerators are exceedingly dangerous. And this is one of the reasons that, as Sharon mentioned, the phrase waste to energy, or the phrase resource recovery, they're intensely problematic misnomers, because incinerators don't magically convert waste to energy. They don't magically recover resources. Waste is burned, and that waste, much of that waste, ends up as dangerous air emissions. So pollutants like carbon dioxide, dioxins, which Sharon mentioned, nitrogen oxides, mercury, lead, sulfur dioxides, all of this is coming out of the stacks of incinerators at very high concentrations and leading to those health impacts that Monica discussed at length. Next slide, please. And it's not just air emissions, because after waste has been burned in an incinerator, we're left with a large amount of incinerator ash. About 25% of the weight of incoming waste is left over as trash. So the idea that that incinerators somehow obviate the need for landfills just isn't true, because you still need to bury all of this ash. And what you're left with is basically a concentrated version of what you would have if you put that waste directly in a landfill in the first place, with, again, high concentrations of those same pollutants, dioxins, lead, mercury, PCBs. All of that ends up in a landfill, and as EPA itself has admitted, all landfills eventually leak. Next slide, please. And so all of that ash has to go somewhere. And in Connecticut, it all ends up, or most of it ends up, in the Wheelabrator Putnam Ash Landfill. In 2018, just shy of 460,000 tons of ash were buried in Putnam. And Wheelabrator is in the process of attempting to double the size of the Wheelabrator Putnam landfill if they get the permissions they're seeking from DEEP right now. Doubling this landfill is only going to continue to prop up the incinerator industry throughout Connecticut and throughout New England, and is just going to further perpetuate many of the inequities that have been discussed tonight. Next slide, please. And so with all of that in mind, and before I hand it off to Alex, I just want to introduce the idea of how we need to move past many of the false choices that have been presented to us and towards that clean, more just zero waste future. Next slide, please. Because even if we could shut down all of the incinerators right away and ship waste out of state, that's not going to solve all of the problems here. Connecticut's already shipping an enormous amount of waste out of state. Again, more than 400,000 tons in 2018 alone. And because Connecticut is already shipping so much waste out of state, we can see where that waste is going. It's not all going to landfills. Much of that waste is going to incinerators in other states. And I have 3 destinations out of many up here on this slide. 2 of these are incinerators, the Wheelabrator Peekskill incinerator in Peekskill, New York, and the Covanta Springfield incinerator located just across the border from Springfield, Massachusetts. Both of those incinerators are located in environmental justice communities. The Southbridge landfill, which received almost 24,000 tons of waste from Connecticut in 2018, is also located in an environmental justice community. So we can't get around the root cause of the problem without significantly and quickly reducing the amount of waste that Connecticut is generating right now. Next slide, please. Because we don't have to choose between burning waste and burying waste. We don't have to choose between incinerators in Connecticut or shipping our waste out of state. The only real choice here, and the only choice that will help address all of these injustices in our waste system, is again to dramatically decrease the amount of waste that we're producing. Next slide, please. And Alex is going to go further in depth on a lot of these solutions, but if we can move collectively towards the right laws, the right programs, the incentives, put those things in place, we can reduce, reuse, divert, recycle, and compost the vast majority of what's in Connecticut's waste. And I have up on this slide a pie graph that reflects Connecticut's waste characterization study from 2015. And this represents everything that's in Connecticut's municipal solid waste. And you can see up here how much of it is paper, plastic, glass, metal, food waste, organics. Those are things that either are or should be recyclable or compostable or reusable or divertible. So much of what's ending up in our waste just doesn't belong there in the first place. And some of it ends up there because of individual decision-making, but the biggest reason that it's ending up there is, again, because we don't have the right laws and programs in place to ensure, that the plastic, the glass, and metal that's moving through our lives in the form of packaging is either reusable or easily recyclable. And the more that we put the right programs in place, the more we can, quote unquote, starve the beast. If there's no waste to serve as fuel at the incinerators can't keep operating. If there's no waste to ship out of state, then Mira can't replace its incinerator with a massive transfer station in Hartford that's only going to bring a different sort of pollution and odor problems with it. If we reduce the waste that we generate, that we dispose of, we can make a significant dent in the injustices that come along with our waste practices in Connecticut. Thanks so much, and I look forward to some small group discussions later.
Thank you, Kevin. That was a very informative presentation. We appreciate it very much. Our next presenter is Alex Rodriguez. As climate advocate for Save the Sound, Alex is responsible for youth mobilization, supporting climate-related communications, coalition building, community engagement, and legislative advocacy. Prior to joining Save the Sound, Alex served as community organizer to the Connecticut League of Conservation Voters, where he planned and executed campaigns relating to climate action, voting rights, and electric school bus advancement. He has also served in roles as the chair of the Public Participation Subcommittee of the Governor's Council on Climate Change and vice chair of Hartford's Advisory Commission on the Environment. Alex, take it away.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you to Cheryl, Sharon, and Kevin. It's always a delight working in coalition with Sharon and Kevin especially. I always learn something new from them in our weekly meetings. Liz, will you bring up the first slide, please? So I'm here to talk to you all about legislative solutions to the waste crisis. Sharon has framed, Sharon and Cheryl have both framed the history of waste and injustices in a very intentional way. And Kevin has rightfully shaped the view in which we should look at these issues: zero waste and reducing, reusing, and improving our recycling system to support that. Next slide, please. So lobbying this year has been very difficult. The legislators have been a little harder to reach than most years, given the weight of the COVID-19 pandemic. What we have myself and many other advocates have noticed is that the legislature is, the committee chairs are pushing for omnibus bills in some of their committees. In a few of my discussions with legislators, they claim that they are setting a goal to try and pass 25 bills per committee, which is a lot for some, or not a lot for others. But one thing in particular that is actually up for public hearing tomorrow is SB 1037, an act concerning solid waste management. And so in this piece of legislation, there are bottle bill provisions. The bottle bill is crucial to our recycling system, making sure that that communities are able to effectively recycle as many bottles, cans, juices, and nip bottles under this provision is extremely important because we need to reduce the amount of litter that we have in the streets and in our ecosystems. Another factor to this bill is expanding on the food waste ban, so holding big food waste generators accountable to composting more than 1 ton of waste within 20 miles. And then there is also a provision in this legislation that supports unit-based pricing, which is a program that has been successful in some states to really help communities realize the weight of when they dispose of trash, how much the cost is associated with that. It's a way to separate the disposal of trash in your bills so that you could see how much you are actually paying to dispose of your trash. And I can take more questions on that later. Next slide, please. So as I was saying earlier, the bottle bill is important to improving recycling in Connecticut, preventing litter, creating jobs. It supports over 1,200 jobs throughout the state and adds about $92 million to our state's economy on a yearly basis. It saves municipalities money on waste collection and disposal. And the modernization aspect, as I mentioned earlier, was really expanding more of what can be accepted at bottle redemption centers. At the moment, there are many bottled coffees, kombucha bottles, Gatorades that aren't accepted at bottle redemption centers, and we need to seize this opportunity, and that is why we're proposing increasing the bottle deposit from 5 cents to 10 cents. Another thing that this does is increases the handling fee to 3.5 cents across the board. This helps businesses thrive and encourages new redemption centers to open. The bottle bill is an economic booster and supports conservation throughout Connecticut. Next slide, please. Updating the state's composting law. And as I mentioned earlier, regarding expanding the food waste ban, there are big food waste generators, such as food courts, hospitals, universities, football stadiums, baseball stadiums, you name it. They produce on average more than 2 tons of waste a year, and we need to make sure that the food waste that they generate is efficiently recycled composted, because our soil needs nutrients in order to ensure us healthy food in the future. And so making sure that big food waste generators are held accountable to recycling the food that they waste in an efficient manner is very important. And other updates that this bill should include that are being passed on, that are being advocated for by some of my colleagues, include removal of exemptions for commercial facilities. So really putting pressure on all commercial entities in Connecticut to make sure that they are composting their food waste. Removal of geographic requirements, lowering of quantifying food waste to 0.5 ton per week by 2023. Fines for businesses that do not comply with effectively recycling their compost, and also funding for DEEP to be able to enforce these measures, to be able to inspect each big food waste site and make sure that they are not just throwing all of their food in the regular big trash bins that you see outside of malls, etc. Next slide, please. So regarding unit-based pricing, disposing of your trash is not free. Just because it is funded out of the tax base, it is funded out of our taxes, but it does not appear as a separate cost. And this is something that needs to be changed, because as Sharon and Kevin have pointed out, disposing of our trash is very effective, and it has is very costly, and it has consequences. According to the EPA, in a 1997 study of unit-based pricing communities. This study found that households, unit-based pricing households generated between 15 and 28% less waste on average in the program's first year than in the year before unit-based pricing began. It is fair to mention, though, that there is an equity concern with unit-based pricing, and the economic effect it would place onto low-income households. They would pay a higher percentage of their income for a unit-based pricing program, and so this is a point of contention in this legislation, but I felt it fair to point out. Next slide, please. Extended producer responsibility. The bill number given to this is HB 6386. This establishes an EPR program for propane gas cylinders, for smoke detectors and waste tires. It establishes a tire hauler's license for scrap tires, but this needs to be strengthened in order to hold manufacturers accountable for the recycling of said items. Extended producer responsibility is accountability to the producers of your products to make sure that what they have generated is disposed of in an effective manner. Extended producer responsibility is critical to the zero waste hierarchy that Kevin had presented on. Another thing that needs to be included is EPR solutions for recycling consumer packaging, because just about everything that we buy at the store is covered in plastic, and there needs to be a more effective way of disposing what we buy, and that is reducing what is originally manufactured. We need to put this responsibility on the manufacturers. Next slide, please. So HB 6502. HB 6502 phases out polystyrene food service packaging and school lunch trays, specifically styrofoam school lunch trays, which is very detrimental to kids' health. When you think about how much hot food is served on a styrofoam school tray, it's one, not very appetizing to look at, and two, has detrimental side effects. Another thing that's included in this omnibus piece of legislation is soft ban on single-use plastic straws. It prohibits the intentional release of helium balloons. So apparently the state has a rule that no more than 10 balloons can be released at a time because of the impact it has on our ecosystem and our animals. And also, it also includes a study of compostable produce bags. And this is a small point of contention because many of the entities who have been promoting compostable produce bags, it's not authentic. It's not 100% biodegradable. So that is another small point of contention to consider when you all are preparing testimony. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oh, okay, thank you. Another thing that has been very near and dear to my heart is strengthening Connecticut's EJ statutes and climate accountability. This is something in direct relation to the permitting process that Sharon had mentioned in her presentation. And I'm sorry that the bill number is not in this. It is HB 6551, an act concerning environmental air quality. What we are aiming for in this legislation is to stop this citing of additional pollution hazards in environmental justice communities, because it is so often that these communities have been saddled with more and more environmental injustices. We are striving for climate accountability in addition to this, because the state has a goal to meet of 45% greenhouse gas reduction by 2030, and the incinerators are detrimental. They get in the way of this goal, because the more and more trash that is burned, the more carbon dioxide that is released into the air, and the more our communities suffer, and the more global warming accelerates. And so we are striving to hold the state accountable to the goals sought out by the Global Warming Solutions Act. Next slide, please. So I just included some small tips of what you can do to reduce waste. Use a reusable bottle or cup for beverages on the go. Reuse your grocery bags. Purchase wisely and recycle. Think of the zero waste hierarchy that Kevin had mentioned earlier. Compost if you can. Dig a hole outside. Bury your eggshells. Any unwanted food scraps that you have. Avoid single-use food and drink containers. Support locally, and reduce your intake of paper, mail, receipts, and magazines. Opt for paperless options as much as possible. And that is my presentation, and I'm happy to dive more into community and legislative solutions in the breakout group.
Thank you, Alex. That was very informative in terms of what's pending in terms of legislation. I think what we're going to do, since we're getting close to our time frame, is take questions now. For those of you who would like, please add some questions to the chat, and we can present them to our presenters. I think that in chatting with my colleagues, we're going to forego the breakout rooms today, so that we can end as close to on time as possible. We do appreciate you attending and being patient with us. So Alex, there are some questions about the structure of the diversion waste bill, and whether it's structured properly to work the way you want it to. Do you have any comment on that? Some of the criticism, I think, is about how the bill is structured.
Why does from Laura, does it have to be if structured correctly? Is that the question?
Yep.
Laura, can you
Yeah,
elaborate?
yes, Alex. You mentioned that unit-based pricing is adverse to underserved communities. And I said, if it's structured right, it doesn't have to be. You know, if it's structured right, you could, maybe the community can subsidize the bags. You can have tiered pricing for bags. I don't think we should just discount unit-based pricing because it might be environmentally adverse to certain communities.
I think that's a fair point you raise. I am just conscious of the economic factors that may impact low-income communities. It's unit-based pricing is not my it's not my forte. It's not my top legislative priority. It's something that I can definitely look more into.
Yeah, all I'm saying is that if that is a concern of yours right from the beginning when you're designing the program, if you keep that in mind, I think you can address those concerns.
Thank you.
Yeah,
may I add a point too? Oh, go ahead, Kevin.
Oh, thanks, Cheryl. Yeah, I was just going to say that, you know, there are examples of communities that have implemented unit-based pricing in a way that takes Alex's concerns into account, because, and I agree with Laura that, you know, if you take those concerns into account up front, you can design it in an appropriate way. I believe Malden, Massachusetts is an example of a community that used grant funding, community block grant funding, to defray the cost of unit-based pricing for folks that were below a certain income threshold. Because yes, if you're charging a set amount for, you know, each bag to throw away trash, the concern that that could be a regressive tax, I think, is real. But towns and cities like Malden show us that there's a path forward to do it in a way that without it becoming a regressive tax, you can make a significant dent in the amount of waste that's thrown away, thereby helping, you know, address the significant injustices that we've been discussing.
Cheryl, did you have something to add?
Yeah, for people who are attending this that are just sort of being introduced to the concept, I just wanted a different way of explaining it. Unit-based pricing is a program that treats trash like a utility. So we all who are homeowners have to pay for water. Those that are renters and homeowners, we have to pay for electric or gas, or perhaps other utilities, maybe our cable bill or our Wi-Fi. And likewise, trash becomes a utility. And with that, you can conserve. So you can save on your electric bill or your gas bill or your water bill by conserving. And so the intention of a unit-based pricing program is to provide an incentive to help us conserve. And in this case, it would help you conserve by reducing the amount of trash you generate, and thus you would save money when you did so. It is true that depending on how the program is set up, it can have an impact on low income. But just like utility programs, we have a lot of utility programs that support people who have a challenge in making their electric bill or their water bill, et cetera. And so you can feed that into it. So I just wanted to give a little bit of context for folks that may not understand how a program works, whether it be bags, carts, or anything else. It's really just treating your trash like a utility. Thank you.
One question we have is, where can I find information on energy provided by waste to energy incinerators? And where can I find information on GHG emissions by the same incinerators? So how much energy do the waste energy plants actually produce is part of the question.
Mm-hmm. Kevin?
Kevin, you must know the answer. Oh, do you know, Alex?
No, I was going to point to Kevin.
I don't have an exact figure on the amount of energy that's generated, but generally speaking, it is a small amount of energy. Incinerators are not providing a significant portion of, by any means, of the waste that's, of the energy that's being consumed in the state of Connecticut. When it comes to information on the greenhouse gas emissions and other emissions from incinerators, I think that a really good resource on a lot of that information is an organization that's run by a friend of ours that's called the Energy Justice Network. They run by Mike Ewald. They have a lot of really good information on he's done a lot of work categorizing a lot of the data on incinerator emissions, a lot of the disparate and unjust impacts of incinerators. So that's a really good resource for a lot of data and information on this stuff.
I would add too that incinerators are not designed to create energy, they're designed to burn trash. And while you might have new facilities that really are more efficient in creating and capturing that energy, I believe the Connecticut facilities are quite old and may not be as up to par as some of the newer facilities you might find elsewhere in the state.
Okay, I have a question for Kevin. For the waste that is shipped to the Massachusetts landfills, does that include soil that is used as landfill cap, or does the value presented exclude soil? Just asking because Southbridge is typically the final destination for clean soil from environmental remediation jobs.
Yeah, and I just note the use of quotes around clean in that comment or that question. I assume, Melissa, that you're referring to the fact that this is not in fact clean soil, and the things that are used as landfill cover are often highly toxic and present a whole additional set of problems when it comes to the generation of toxic landfill leachate. But to answer the question itself, the tonnage data that was in what I presented did not include soil. That was just anything that would be classified as municipal solid waste coming from Connecticut, which doesn't include those types of separated contaminated soils that are being used as landfill cover. Tracking what's being used as landfill cover and where it came from presents a whole additional set of problems. It's very difficult, and great records are not kept on that, which is a problem, because especially when you're talking about contaminated soil being used as cover, what's going into and impacting the toxicity and emissions from landfills isn't just the waste. It's also the cover and in any number of other things that can end up in a landfill.
Okay, I have a question. There's a question on the bottle bill. Also, what are the potentially new economic incentives for the opening of new bottle redemption centers? I guess part of the issue is the rate at which redemption centers are reimbursed is so low that it doesn't pay for them to almost operate. So in the new proposal, does that increase that fee?
Does it increase the handling fee?
The payment to the redemption centers?
The bottle bill is going to, the expansion of the bottle bill is going to bring in significantly more than it is now on a collective level. As to the rate at which bottle redemption centers will open versus can the person who presented that question, can you elaborate?
Yeah, hi. So my name is Zach. I'm working with the town of Clinton for their energy redemption. And we're looking at expanding some of our sites. We have a transfer center and we have another remediation site. So for my town, potentially opening a new redemption center, I'm just trying to understand, you mentioned that the redemption might increase from 5 to 10 cents and there might be incentive for new redemption centers to open. I'm trying to understand that.
The incentive is more and more people recycling.
No, I meant economically for attracting the business to attract a business to open a redemption center in my locality.
It's
Yeah,
really demand.
Alex, if I can jump in here, the increase of the handling fee to 3.5 cents would have a big impact there. So currently there are 2 different handling fees under the current bottle bill in Connecticut. One of them is 1.5 cents and one of them is 2 cents. So the handling fee is paid to the redemption center for each container that they're collecting and processing. So with that increase in the handling fee, it'll make it much more economically viable to sustain current redemption centers and to open new ones. And the state of New York offers a great example here. A number of years ago, New York increased its handling fee. And over the course of the next 5 to 7 years, they had thousands of new redemption centers open because with a higher handling fee, that was the incentive. It made it economically viable to open new redemption centers.
Exactly what I was looking at.
Yeah, so the hope is that with a 3.5 cent handling fee, which is appropriate in this day and age compared to a 1.5 cent handling fee, that we'll see an explosion of redemption centers, which is important because it makes it easier for people to redeem their containers. It's hard when you pay a deposit on a container and there's no redemption center anywhere nearby. How are you going to get your money back? By modernizing the system, it'll make it possible for everyone to more easily get their deposits back and create a more fully functioning bottle bill.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. What I'd like to do is anyone who wanted to unmute and ask a question, that might be the most efficient way to address our panelists. Also, I saw there was a question asked whether the recordings will be available. They will be available to everyone that attended, and just give us a chance to fine tune them, and they'll be sent out to everybody. Are there any questions about unit-based pricing and how it will affect each of us? It's a very controversial issue. Some people call it a new tax, others people say it's not. Does everyone understand what the unit-based pricing process would be? Any questions? Great. At this point, again, because we are a little bit over the time we allotted, we are not going to do the breakout rooms, so we apologize for that. It would have been an opportunity to talk with our panelists a little more intimately, but we're also getting late and we appreciate that. So I just want to thank everyone for attending. I want to thank our panelists so much. You are all terrific. And I just want to remind you that this is the first of a 7-part series. And if you haven't registered for the remaining sessions, you can do so by going to Rock Fall's website at rockfallfoundation.org. And again, thank you to our panelists and thank you all for attending, and have a good evening.
Thank you all so much. We hope to see you in a week.